April 18, 1942, 650 miles east of Japan. The deck of the aircraft carrier USS Hornet pitched and rolled in heavy Pacific swells as Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle stood beside the most improbable weapon in American military history. Behind him, lashed to the carrier's deck, sat 16 North American B-25 Mitchell medium bombers, twin-engine aircraft never designed to operate from ships, preparing to launch on a mission that naval aviators had declared impossible. In Berlin, German intelligence officers reviewing reports of American bomber development had dismissed the B-25 as a compromised design, too small to be strategic, too large to be tactical, lacking the range for meaningful operations across the vast Pacific. Luftwaffe technical staff analysing captured photographs noted its conventional layout, modest bomb load, and unremarkable performance. The assessment filed in March 1942 concluded that the Mitchell posed no significant threat to Axis operations. What those German analysts failed to understand, what Japanese defenders would discover in the most shocking way possible, was that American engineering wasn't constrained by conventional thinking. The B-25 Mitchell represented a uniquely American approach to aerial warfare, a medium bomber designed not for a specific mission, but for adaptation to any mission, a platform that could be modified, improved, and transformed to meet needs its designers never imagined. The story of how this supposedly mediocre bomber became the most versatile combat aircraft of World War II, how it launched from an aircraft carrier to strike the Japanese homeland, how it evolved into a ship-killing gunship that rewrote the rules of maritime warfare, and how German and Japanese pilots learned to fear its devastating firepower, reveals everything about American industrial ingenuity and tactical innovation. The North American B-25 Mitchell emerged from a 1938 Army Air Corps requirement for a medium bomber to replace aging Douglas B-18s. The specifications called for a twin-engine aircraft capable of carrying 2,400 pounds of bombs for some 200 miles at 300 miles per hour, with a crew of 5 and defensive armament of 3 machine guns. North American Aviation, a relatively small company based in Inglewood, California, had never built a bomber. Their experience consisted primarily of training aircraft and the unsuccessful NA-40 light bomber prototype that had crashed during Army evaluation. But Chief Engineer Raymond Rice and lead designer Robert Woods approached the new requirement with fresh thinking, unconstrained by conventional bomber design doctrine. The NA-62, as it was initially designated, first flew on August 19, 1940, 9 months before Pearl Harbor. Test pilot Vance Breeze reported that the aircraft handled like a fighter, responsive and stable, with excellent visibility and forgiving characteristics. The Army Air Corps, impressed by both the aircraft and North Americans' aggressive production, Timeline ordered 184 aircraft off the drawing board before the prototype had completed testing. They named it the Mitchell, after General Billy Mitchell, the controversial advocate of air power who had been court-martialed for his outspoken views, but vindicated by the rise of military aviation. The production B-25 that began rolling out of the Inglewood factory in February 1941 was unremarkable by design. 2 Wright R2600 Cyclone radial engines, each producing 1,700 horsepower, gave it a top speed of 272 miles per hour. The bomb bay could carry 3,000 pounds internally. Defensive armament consisted of 350 caliber machine guns, 1 in the nose, 1 in the tail, and 1 in a dorsal turret. The crew of 5 included pilot, co-pilot, bombardier navigator, radio operator, and tail gunner. On paper, it was inferior to German medium bombers like the Heinkel He-111 or Junkers Ju-88 in nearly every performance category. What made the Mitchell exceptional was what couldn't be quantified in specification sheets. The wing design, using a revolutionary gull wing configuration that simplified landing gear retraction, provided exceptional stability at low altitude. The tricycle landing gear, still uncommon in 1941, gave pilots excellent visibility during taxi and takeoff. The cockpit layout was spacious and ergonomic, with controls positioned logically, rather than wherever engineers could fit them. Most significantly, the airframe was massively overbuilt, with structural strength far exceeding calculated requirements. This combination of stability, ruggedness, and adaptability would prove more valuable than raw performance. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, the B-25 Mitchell was the most modern bomber in American inventory, and also the most available, with over 200 aircraft delivered or in production. As the nation reeled from Pearl Harbor, searching desperately for some way to strike back at Japan, President Franklin Roosevelt pressed military planners for options. Strike the Japanese homeland, Roosevelt demanded. Show them they're vulnerable. Show Americans we can fight back. I don't care how you do it, just do it. The problem seemed insurmountable. American carriers couldn't approach close enough to launch their short-range naval aircraft without certain destruction. Land-based bombers in China and the Philippines lacked the range to reach Japan and return. The Soviet Union, not yet at war with Japan, refused to allow American aircraft to operate from their territory. Every conventional option led to a dead end. Then Captain Francis Lowe, a submariner on Admiral Ernest King's staff, watched Army bombers practicing at Norfolk Naval Base and had an audacious idea. What if we could launch Army bombers from an aircraft carrier? Lowe took the concept to Captain Donald Duncan, King's Air Operations Officer, who initially dismissed it as impossible. Army bombers were too heavy, too large, and required too much runway for carrier operations. But Duncan couldn't shake the idea. He contacted retired naval aviator Captain Mark Mitcher, then commanding the new carrier USS Hornet, and posed a hypothetical question. Could you launch Army bombers from your flight deck? Mitcher's response was characteristically blunt. I don't know, but if anyone can figure it out, get me Doolittle. Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle, at 45 years old, was one of the most famous aviators in America. He had won the Schneider Trophy race, set the world speed record, pioneered instrument flying, earned a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from MIT, and worked as a test pilot for Shell Oil, developing high-octane aviation fuel. Recalled to active duty in 1940, Doolittle was exactly the kind of innovator needed for an impossible mission. In January 1942, Doolittle was summoned to a secret meeting with Admiral William Halsey and presented with the challenge. We want to bomb Japan from a carrier. We think the B-25 is the only aircraft that might work. Can you train pilots to do it and lead the mission? Doolittle studied the numbers. The Hornet's flight deck was 800 feet long. A B-25 normally required 3,000 feet for takeoff at full load. The weight would have to be reduced, the distance shortened, the technique perfected. But the Wright Cyclone engines had enormous power, and the Mitchell's gull-wing design generated exceptional lift at low speeds. It might possibly barely be achievable. Doolittle's answer was immediate. Give me 3 weeks, and I'll know if it's possible. If it is, I'll train the crews and lead them myself. Testing began at Eglin Field in Florida under absolute secrecy. Doolittle selected B-25B models, the latest variant with improved armament and systems. He had engineers strip everything non-essential, removing the ventral turret, reducing ammunition loads, even removing the liaison radio set. They installed additional fuel tanks in every available space, including rubber bladders in the bomb bay that could be jettisoned after draining. Fully modified, each Mitchell carried 141 gallons of fuel, nearly double the standard load. The critical test came on February 3, 1942. Lieutenant John Fitzgerald, an experienced B-25 pilot, attempted the first short-field takeoff at maximum weight. The Mitchell accelerated down Eglin's runway, engines straining, Doolittle watching with stopwatch in hand. At 467 feet, well short of the carrier deck length, Fitzgerald rotated and the bomber clawed into the air. Doolittle turned to his engineering team. It'll work. Now we need to find pilots crazy enough to volunteer. The call went out through B-25 squadrons. Volunteers needed for an extremely hazardous mission. Nature and destination classified. Likelihood of survival uncertain. Over 200 pilots volunteered within 48 hours. Doolittle selected 24 crews, 80 men total, and began intensive training at Eglin. They practiced short-field takeoffs until they could launch in under 500 feet. They studied low-level navigation and night flying. They rehearsed bombing runs against simulated industrial targets. What they didn't practice, because no one had ever done it, was landing a B-25 on a carrier. The plan called for a one-way mission. After bombing Japan, the raiders would fly to friendly Chinese airfields, refuel, and continue to Chongqing. Recovery aboard the Hornet was physically impossible. The Mitchell couldn't land on a carrier deck and the bomber was too large to strike below to the hangar deck. This would be a suicide mission for the aircraft, and possibly for the crews if they couldn't reach China. On April 2, 1942, 16 B-25Bs were hoisted aboard the USS Hornet at Alameda Naval Air Station in San Francisco. The sight of Army bombers lashed to a carrier deck astonished everyone who saw it. Sailors joked about the Army joining the Navy. Naval aviators expressed professional skepticism, bordering on scorn about Army pilots attempting carrier operations. The consensus among experienced carrier pilots was clear: this stunt would end in disaster. The Hornet, escorted by Task Force 16 including the carrier USS Enterprise, set sail on April 8th, destination classified even to most of the task force. Only when the ships turned west into the Pacific did the crews realize they were heading toward Japan. On April 13th, Doolittle gathered the volunteer crews and finally revealed the mission. "We're going to bomb Tokyo, along with Yokohama, Osaka, Kobe and Nagoya. We'll launch from the Hornet, strike our targets at low altitude and fly to China. The Japanese don't think we can reach them. We're going to prove them wrong." The plan called for launching on April 19th from a point 450 miles east of Japan, close enough to ensure the bombers could reach China after attacking. But at dawn on April 18th, the task force encountered Japanese patrol boat Nito Maru 23. The picket boat radioed a warning before being sunk by the cruiser USS Nashville. The element of surprise was compromised. Admiral Halsey faced an impossible decision: abort the mission and withdraw, or launch immediately from 650 miles out, well beyond the planned range. Doolittle requested launch approval. "We can still make it if we launch now and the winds are favourable. If we turn back, the Japanese win. They'll know we tried and failed. Let's show them what American bombers can do." At 8:20 a.m., with the Hornet's deck pitching in heavy seas and wind gusting to 30 knots, Doolittle's B-25 positioned at the bow. The deck crew had marked a white line showing the left wheel track, giving pilots a visual reference to keep the left wing clear of the carrier's island superstructure. Doolittle would have less than 500 feet of deck, launching into a headwind with waves occasionally washing over the bow. As the Hornet pitched upward on a swell, the deck officer signalled launch. Doolittle advanced the throttles to full power. The right cyclones roared, propellers clawing air, the bomber straining against the wheel chocks. At the signal, the chocks were pulled. The B-25 accelerated down the deck, gathering speed with painful slowness, the fully loaded bomber wallowing in the headwind. Sailors watching held their breath as the Mitchell reached the bow and plunged toward the water. For a sickening moment, the aircraft disappeared below the flight deck level. Then the gull wings bit air, generating lift, and Doolittle's bomber climbed away from the sea. On the Hornet's deck, sailors erupted in cheers. Behind Doolittle, the remaining 15 bombers launched at 5-minute intervals. The last aircraft, piloted by Lieutenant William Farrow, had the shortest deck run after the carrier's bow rose on a swell. Farrow's B-25 cleared the deck with feet to spare, nearly stalling before gaining airspeed. All 16 bombers launched successfully, an achievement naval aviation experts had declared impossible. In Japan, the morning of April 18th was a Saturday, a school day for children, a work day for adults in the factories and shipyards. Air raid drills had been conducted since 1937, but they were treated as formalities. The Japanese home islands were invulnerable. American bombers couldn't reach Japan. The Imperial Navy controlled the Pacific. The homeland was safe. At 12:15 p.m. Tokyo time, air raid sirens began wailing across the capital. Civilians assumed it was another drill until they heard the sound of aircraft engines low and close, too low for Japanese bombers on training flights. People looked up to see twin-engine aircraft roaring over rooftops at 500 feet, American White Stars clearly visible on the wings. Doolittle's B-25 crossed the Japanese coast at precisely noon, exactly on schedule despite launching 200 miles farther than planned. Navigator Lieutenant Henry Potter had guided them perfectly across the Pacific using dead reckoning and celestial navigation. Bombardier Sergeant Fred Bramer armed the 4 500-pound demolition bombs and prepared for the attack run. Tokyo spread below them, vast and undefended. Japanese fighters, scrambled late after the alarm, were climbing toward the bombers but couldn't reach altitude in time. Anti-aircraft fire was scattered and inaccurate. The Japanese defenders had never imagined low-level attack, and their guns weren't positioned for it. Bramer released the bombs from below 500 feet, striking factories and military installations in northern Tokyo. The incendiary clusters ignited immediately, sending pillars of smoke rising into the clear spring sky. Behind Doolittle, the other bombers struck their assigned targets across Tokyo, Yokohama, Osaka, Kobe and Nagoya. The explosive weight dropped was modest, only 16 tons total, less than a single heavy bomber raid in Europe. but the psychological impact was incalculable. The Japanese homeland, sacred and inviolable, had been attacked. American bombers had struck at will and departed unscathed. The myth of invulnerability shattered in 30 seconds over Tokyo. Lieutenant Robert Gray, piloting the 9th B-25, encountered Japanese fighters over Tokyo Bay. A Mitsubishi A5M Claude, obsolete by 1942 standards but still dangerous, made a head-on pass. Gray's nose gunner, Corporal Leland Factor, opened fire with the single .50 caliber machine gun, the first shots fired in anger from a Mitchell bomber. The Japanese fighter broke off trailing smoke. Whether it was destroyed was never confirmed, but it didn't pursue. After bombing, the 16 raiders turned west toward China, racing against fuel consumption and gathering darkness. The premature launch meant they would reach the Chinese coast after dark, flying into unknown territory with no navigational aids and uncertain weather. Several aircraft developed fuel system problems. Lieutenant Ted Lawson's bomber was leaking fuel from a transfer pump failure. Lieutenant Donald Smith's bomber had battle damage from anti-aircraft fire over Tokyo. All of them were operating on fumes. As night fell, the weather deteriorated. Heavy rain and turbulence buffeted the bombers. Chinese nationalist forces, informed by radio of the incoming aircraft, were supposed to light signal fires and activate radio beacons. Either the message never arrived, or conditions prevented compliance. The raiders flew into darkness and silence. At 9:30 p.m., Doolittle's bomber ran out of fuel over the Chinese coast. Unable to find an airfield, the crew bailed out in the darkness and rain. Doolittle landed in a rice paddy, survived the landing, and spent the night convinced the mission had failed and expecting court-martial for losing all 16 aircraft. Of the 16 bombers, 15 crews bailed out or crash-landed in China. One crew flew to Vladivostok in the Soviet Union, where they were interned for the remainder of the war. 11 complete crews survived. 2 men drowned after bailing out over the ocean. 8 men were captured by Japanese forces occupying eastern China. Of those 8, 3 were executed by firing squad. 1 died of malnutrition in captivity, and 4 survived until liberation. The human cost was significant, but the mission accomplished something unprecedented. American bombers had struck Japan from an aircraft carrier. The impossible had become real. In Berlin, German intelligence officers studying reports of the Tokyo Raid initially refused to believe them. American medium bombers launched from a carrier? Impossible. The technical requirements couldn't be met. This must be propaganda or a trick. Luftwaffe analysts calculated takeoff distances, fuel loads, and ranges. Their conclusion confirmed impossibility. American bombers couldn't reach Japan from available bases. Therefore, the raids must have originated from either Chinese airfields much closer than reported, or from a suicide mission with no return planned. The possibility that Americans had actually launched B-25s from a carrier was dismissed as technically absurd. What German analysts failed to appreciate was American willingness to attempt the absurd and engineering skill to achieve it. The Doolittle Raid, as it became known, electrified American morale at a moment when the war news consisted entirely of defeats. More significantly, it forced Japanese strategic reconsideration. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, demanded action to ensure the homeland couldn't be attacked again. This led directly to the Japanese decision to attack Midway, an operation intended to draw out and destroy American carriers. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 resulted in catastrophic Japanese defeat, 4 carriers sunk, and the turning point of the Pacific War. The Doolittle Raid, executed by 16 medium bombers dismissed by German intelligence as insignificant, had changed the strategic calculus of the entire war. But the B-25 story was just beginning. While the Tokyo Raid captured headlines, Mitchell bombers were quietly revolutionizing tactical air warfare in theaters around the world. In the Southwest Pacific, Major General George Kenney, commanding the 5th Air Force, recognized that the B-25's stability and rugged construction made it ideal for low-altitude attack. But he also understood that the standard bomber configuration, with defensive armament designed to protect against fighter attack, was wrong for ground attack missions. Kenney called in Major Paul Gunn, a maintenance officer and former airline pilot, and gave him an extraordinary mandate. Take some B-25s and turn them into gunships. I want them to destroy Japanese shipping and airfields. I don't care how you do it. Gunn was already experimenting with field modifications, adding forward-firing machine guns in the nose of transport aircraft. For the B-25, he envisioned something unprecedented. Remove the bombardier, the bomb sight, and the greenhouse nose. Install it with armor plate and pack it with machine guns. Add guns in the sides, in the waist positions, anywhere we can fit them. Make it a flying machine gun nest. The first field-modified B-25C emerged from Gunn's workshop at Port Moresby in September 1942. The nose had been replaced with a solid metal fairing containing 450 caliber machine guns. 2 more guns protruded from waist blisters on each side of the fuselage. Combined with the dorsal turret's twin 50s, this single Mitchell carried 10 forward-firing machine guns. Kenny took one look at the monster and ordered immediate production of more. The test mission came on December 17, 1942, against Japanese positions at Oro Bay. 6 modified B-25s swept in at masthead height, guns blazing. The combined firepower was staggering. Each aircraft could fire 6,000 rounds per minute from its forward guns. Anything caught in that stream of lead was obliterated. Japanese positions, built to resist bombing from altitude, offered no protection against horizontal fire at point-blank range. The modified Mitchells destroyed 15 buildings, killed over 100 Japanese soldiers, and returned, without loss. Kenny immediately ordered conversion of every available B-25 to the gunship configuration. But Paul Gunn wasn't finished. In early 1943, he proposed something even more audacious: put a 75mm cannon in the nose. A cannon, in a bomber. The M4 75mm cannon, standard armament for Sherman tanks, fired a 15-pound shell capable of penetrating 3 inches of armor or demolishing a concrete bunker. Gunn proposed mounting this artillery piece in the nose of a B-25, creating a flying tank destroyer. Engineers declared it impossible. The recoil would tear the aircraft apart. The weight would make it unflyable. The muzzle blast would damage the airframe. Gunn ignored them and installed a cannon anyway. The first test firing on February 2, 1943, nearly ended in disaster. The recoil slammed the nose down violently, causing the pilot to fight for control. The muzzle blast cracked the greenhouse panels on a nearby aircraft, but the shell struck its target dead center at 500 yards. After adjustments to the mounting and recoil system, the B-25G entered production with a 75mm cannon and 4 50 caliber machine guns in the nose. The Japanese had never encountered anything like it. In March 1943, they were about to discover what American innovation could achieve. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea would demonstrate the Mitchell's evolution from conventional bomber to ship-killing weapon. Japanese convoys attempting to reinforce garrisons in New Guinea travelled at night, seeking protection from Allied air attack. On March 1, 1943, a convoy of 8 transports and 8 destroyers departed Rabaul carrying 6,700 troops and supplies destined for Leh. Allied intelligence detected the convoy immediately. Kenny assembled every available aircraft in New Guinea, including 13 B-25 gunships from the 3rd Attack Group, for what he called skip bombing. The concept was simple but devastating. Instead of bombing from altitude where evasion and anti-aircraft fire reduced accuracy, B-25s would attack at masthead height, releasing bombs that skipped across the water like stones, striking ships at the waterline where armour was weakest. The attacking pilot could see the bombs hit, making it simple gunnery rather than complex bombardment. On March 3rd, the weather cleared over the Bismarck Sea. The Japanese convoy, believing itself safe from attack in poor weather, was steaming in formation when the Allied aircraft appeared. B-25 gunships came in first, roaring toward the transports at wave-top height. Japanese sailors manning deck guns fired desperately, but the bombers were too fast, too low, and too heavily armed. The Mitchells opened fire at 1,000 yards. 10 50 caliber machine guns per aircraft, combined firepower that swept the decks clean of defenders. At 500 yards, the pilots released their bombs. The 500-pound weapons skipped across the water, bounced once or twice, and smashed into the ship's hulls at or below the waterline. The explosions were catastrophic, tearing holes that flooded compartments instantly. The transport Kyokusei Maru took 3 skip bombs in rapid succession and broke in half. The Teiyo Maru exploded when a bomb penetrated to its ammunition magazine. One by one, the transports were destroyed. The destroyers tried to protect them, laying smoke screens and firing their anti-aircraft weapons, but they couldn't stop the waves of attacking bombers. By the end of March 3rd, all 8 transports and 4 destroyers had been sunk. Over 3,000 Japanese soldiers drowned. Only 800 survivors made it to shore. The Americans lost 5 aircraft total, none of them B-25s. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea marked a turning point in Pacific warfare. Japanese commanders realized their convoys were helpless against low-level air attack. They couldn't reinforce isolated garrisons by sea. Their troops were stranded, cut off, doomed to eventual starvation or defeat. And the weapon that had destroyed them was a medium bomber the Germans had dismissed as insignificant. The success of gunship Mitchells in the Southwest Pacific led to factory production of the B-25H, the most heavily armed bomber in history. The H model mounted a 75mm cannon, 8 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns in the nose, 2 more 50s in the dorsal turret, 2 in the tail, and 2 in waist blisters. Total armament was 14 machine guns plus the cannon. Some aircraft were field-modified to carry 18 machine guns. Lieutenant Thomas Maguire, who had become one of America's top aces with 38 victories, described encountering a B-25H while flying fighter cover. I watched one make a strafing run on a Japanese airfield. It looked like a horizontal firestorm. Every gun was firing. The tracers formed a solid stream of light. Buildings exploded, aircraft disintegrated, nothing survived. I realized our fighters were obsolete. These bombers had more firepower than an entire fighter squadron. In Europe, B-25 Mitchells were flying a different kind of war. The medium bomber groups of the 12th and 15th Air Forces conducted strategic attacks on transportation, industry, and military targets across Italy, southern France, and the Balkans. The Mitchell proved ideal for medium-altitude precision bombing against bridges, rail yards, and marshalling areas. The 321st Bomb Group, the Hells Angels, specialized in bridge destruction. Their tactics evolved into a deadly science. Mitchells would attack in tight formation, 18 or 36 aircraft from 10,000 to 12,000 feet. Lead bombardiers would mark the target with colored smoke bombs. Following aircraft would pattern their bombs around the markers. The concentration of high explosive could destroy the most heavily constructed bridges. On July 10, 1943, the 321st attacked the rail bridge at San Stefano in Sicily. 48 B-25s dropped 288 and 500-pound bombs in less than 2 minutes. The bridge, a massive stone structure that had carried rail traffic since 1870, collapsed into the river. German engineers estimated it would take 6 months to repair. The Allies landed in Sicily 2 days later. German forces defending Italy learned to respect and fear the Mitchell. Unlike heavy bombers attacking from high altitude, B-25s operated in the medium range where flak was most effective but bombing was most accurate. The bombers absorbed punishment and kept flying. Luftwaffe fighters discovered that attacking B-25 formations was a dangerous proposition. The dorsal and tail turrets provided interlocking fields of fire. Formations flew tight enough that attacking any one bomber exposed the fighter to fire from multiple aircraft. Lieutenant Fritz Homburg of Jägerschwader 53 attacked a Mitchell formation over Rome in September 1943. His after-action report captured German frustration. I made a textbook approach from 6 o'clock high, diving through the formation to attack the trailing aircraft. The tailgunner opened fire at 800 meters, impossibly long range, but the American machine guns have incredible reach. I pressed the attack, scoring hits on the fuselage and wing. The bomber did not fall. Instead, every other bomber in the formation opened fire on me. I counted at least 4 turrets tracking my aircraft. The stream of tracer was so heavy it looked like flak. I broke off with damage to my wing and fuselage. The bomber I attacked was last seen flying in formation, apparently undamaged. These aircraft are far tougher than intelligence reports suggest. The Mitchell's reputation for absorbing damage became legendary. Lieutenant Robert Hicks of the 340th Bomb Group returned from a mission over Italy with 374 flak holes in his aircraft. The right engine was dead, the hydraulic system shot out, half the tail surface gone, and a 4-foot section of the wing missing. He landed successfully at base, and the aircraft was repaired and flying again within 48 hours. In the Pacific, the B-25's evolution into a maritime strike weapon continued. The J model, entering service in late 1943, mounted 12 fixed forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns, 8 in the nose and 4 in cheek blisters on the fuselage sides. Some aircraft were field-modified to 18 guns. Combined with rockets and bombs, the Mitchell could attack and destroy anything that floated. Japanese shipping, already strangled by American submarines, faced systematic annihilation from the air. Mitchell squadrons flew armed reconnaissance missions along shipping lanes, hunting targets of opportunity. A single B-25 could destroy an entire convoy. The typical attack profile began with a masthead approach, below radar coverage, until visual contact was established. The Mitchell would then pull up to 500 feet, far enough above the water to avoid mast strikes but close enough for accurate fire. At 1,000 yards, the pilot would open fire with all forward guns while the bombardier armed the weapons. The combined firepower from 12 or 18 machine guns created a beaten zone of destruction that no ship could survive. Deck guns were silenced, bridge structures shredded, personnel killed or driven to cover. At 300 yards, the pilot would release bombs set for delayed fusing. The weapons would skip into the ship's hull, penetrate and detonate inside. Finally, as the Mitchell roared over the stricken vessel, the tail and turret gunners would rake the decks with additional fire. The entire attack took less than 30 seconds. Few ships survived. On November 2, 1943, a single B-25J, piloted by Captain Kenneth McCullough, attacked a Japanese convoy off New Britain. In one pass, McCullough sank 2 cargo ships and damaged a third so severely it had to be beached. His combat report was matter of fact. Approached from the southeast at 500 feet, opened fire at 200 yards with all forward guns. First target 4,000-ton cargo vessel showed immediate fires on deck. Released 2 1,000-pound bombs at 400 yards. Both weapons struck hull at waterline. Target exploded and began sinking. Second target 3,000-ton cargo vessel, engaged with remaining ammunition. Multiple fires observed. Released remaining bombs, both strikes observed. Target listing heavily and on fire. Third target, larger cargo vessel approximately 6,000 tons, engaged with tail and turret guns during departure. Fires observed. All attacks completed in single pass. Total time over target 35 seconds. German naval intelligence, reviewing reports of American air attacks on Japanese shipping, initially dismissed the accounts as exaggerated. A single twin-engine bomber sinking multiple ships in one pass was impossible. But as reports accumulated and Japanese shipping losses mounted into the thousands, the truth became undeniable. The Americans had created an anti-ship weapon more effective than submarines or surface vessels. In early 1944, the German Navy conducted war games to assess the threat. The conclusion was sobering. B-25 gunships, if deployed against German shipping in European waters, would make daylight convoy operations impossible. Fortunately for Germany, the Mitchells were primarily deployed in the Pacific, where their unique capabilities were most needed. But some B-25 units did operate over European waters, and they proved just as deadly there. The 321st Bomb Group attacked German shipping in the Adriatic with devastating effect. On April 17, 1944, 24 Mitchells caught a German convoy of 4 cargo ships and 3 escort vessels off the Dalmatian coast. Using skip bombing tactics learned from the Pacific, they sank all 4 cargo ships and 2 escorts in 10 minutes. The sole surviving escort limped into port so heavily damaged it never returned to service. By mid-1944, the Mitchell was operating in every theatre of the war. In China, the 1st Bomb Squadron, the Red Devils, attacked Japanese positions along the Burma Road. In the Mediterranean, B-25s struck targets across Italy, France, and the Balkans. In the Southwest Pacific, they hunted Japanese shipping and supported ground operations. In Alaska and the Aleutians, they flew maritime patrol and strike missions. And throughout the war, they trained thousands of aircrew who would go on to fly other aircraft or lead peacetime aviation. The training role, often overlooked, was perhaps the Mitchell's most important contribution. The aircraft's forgiving handling characteristics and robust construction made it ideal for teaching combat tactics. Student pilots could make mistakes that would be fatal in less stable aircraft and survive to learn. Bombardiers could practice their craft with confidence. Gunners could train with live ammunition. The Mitchell could absorb the abuse of training and keep flying. By late 1944, the strategic situation had shifted dramatically. Germany was retreating on all fronts, Japan was isolated and starving, and Allied air superiority was absolute. The B-25, designed as a medium bomber for contested airspace, evolved into a close air support weapon. In Italy, Mitchell's squadron supported ground advances with pinpoint strikes on German positions. The aircraft would orbit above friendly lines until called in by forward observers. Targets would be marked with smoke, and the Mitchells would attack with 500-pound bombs or fragmentation clusters. The accuracy was remarkable. Bombs consistently landed within 100 feet of the target, close enough to suppress enemy positions without endangering friendly troops. German veterans of the Italian campaign remembered the Mitchells with particular dread. Unlike heavy bombers that attacked from altitude with area weapons, B-25s delivered precision strikes that found troops even in hardened positions. Lieutenant Johann Schmidt of the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division described an attack near Monte Cassino in March 1944. "We were dug into defensive positions on the hillside, bunkers covered with logs and earth. We'd survived British artillery and American heavy bombers. Then the twin-engine aircraft appeared, flying low, maybe 3,000 meters altitude. They circled once as if studying the position. Then they attacked in formation, 6 aircraft. The bombs fell like a stick of death, marching up the hillside, walking right through our position. The accuracy was terrifying. Each explosion was exactly where a bunker stood. My position took a direct hit. I was buried in the collapse, dug out hours later. Of 40 men in my platoon, 7 survived. The bunkers we thought impregnable were open like tin cans. In the Pacific, the air war entered its final phase with B-25s providing close support for island invasions. During the Philippines campaign, Mitchell squadrons flew armed reconnaissance ahead of advancing troops, destroying Japanese positions, supply dumps and reinforcements before ground forces made contact. The pattern was repeated at Leyte, Luzon, Okinawa, and throughout the island chains. Japanese defenders, already weakened by years of attrition, faced an enemy who controlled the sky absolutely. B-25s attacked at will from any altitude against any target. Japanese fighters, when they appeared at all, were flown by inexperienced pilots who survived measured in minutes. The Mitchell's defensive firepower proved excessive for the threat. Many aircraft had their tail turrets removed and replaced with additional fuel tanks, extending range without compromising survivability. The final variant, the B-25J-32, reflected lessons learned across 3 years of combat. It featured 12 50 caliber machine guns, provisions for rockets, internal fuel capacity of 974 gallons, with provision for drop tanks bringing total capacity to 1,824 gallons, maximum speed of 275 miles per hour at 13,000 feet, service ceiling of 24,000 feet, and the ability to carry 4,000 pounds of bombs, or 3,200 pounds of bombs plus rockets. But more important than specifications was the aircraft's versatility. The same B-25 that skip-bombed Japanese destroyers in the Bismarck Sea could provide close air support in the Philippines, conduct medium-altitude strategic bombing over Italy, fly anti-submarine patrol over the Mediterranean, and train replacement crews in the United States. No other aircraft in any air force could match this operational flexibility. The Germans, analysing captured B-25s in 1944, finally understood what they had missed in their earlier assessments. A Luftwaffe technical report from June 1944, based on examination of a captured B-25J, concluded with remarkable candour. The Mitchell represents a design philosophy fundamentally different from our own. Where we have optimised individual aircraft for specific roles, the Americans have created a platform adaptable to any role. The structural overbuilding we criticised as wasteful enables field modifications impossible with German aircraft. The tricycle landing gear we dismissed as unnecessary complexity provides operational advantages at forward airfields. The radial engines we consider inferior to liquid-cooled designs prove more survivable in combat and easier to maintain under field conditions. Most significantly, the Americans have achieved through industrial standardization what we pursue through engineering excellence. Every Mitchell uses the same engines, same instruments, same weapons, same systems. Parts are interchangeable. Maintenance is simplified. Training is streamlined. A pilot qualified on any B-25 can fly any other B-25. A mechanic trained on one aircraft can service the entire fleet. This is not brilliant engineering. It is brilliant logistics. And in total war, logistics defeats brilliance. The report's conclusion was damning. Had Germany possessed an equivalent to the B-25 Mitchell in 1940, adaptable and producible in quantity, the course of the air war might have been different. Instead, we pursued perfection in specialized designs and achieved capability without capacity. The Americans pursued adequate performance in adaptable designs and achieved overwhelming superiority through mass production. The lesson is clear but comes too late to affect the outcome. By early 1945, the Mitchell was ubiquitous in Allied air forces. Beyond the United States Army Air Forces, the aircraft equipped British, Dutch, Soviet, Chinese, Brazilian, and Free French squadrons. The RAF alone operated over 700 Mitchells, primarily in the Mediterranean and Far East. The Soviet Air Force received 870 aircraft through Lend-Lease, using them for tactical bombing on the Eastern Front. Soviet pilots, accustomed to the rugged but primitive Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovik, were impressed by the Mitchell's sophistication. Major Alexei Marasyev, a highly decorated Soviet pilot who flew both types, wrote in his memoirs, "The American bomber was a revelation. The cockpit was spacious and well-equipped. The instruments actually worked. The heating system kept us warm at altitude, a luxury unknown in Soviet aircraft. The electrical systems were reliable. The aircraft always started even in winter conditions that grounded our domestic bombers. Most impressive was the ruggedness. We flew missions that would have destroyed 3 Il-2s, and the Mitchell absorbed the damage without complaint. American engineering was not just advanced, it was practical. Every system worked as designed, every time. This reliability was more valuable than performance." The final combat operations of World War II saw B-25s attacking targets across Japan itself. Based in Okinawa and Iwo Jima, Mitchell squadrons struck airfields, railroads, and coastal installations throughout the home islands. The Japanese, their fighter force depleted and fuel exhausted, could offer minimal resistance. On August 15, 1945, the day Japan announced its surrender, B-25s of the 345th Bomb Group were attacking targets near Tokyo. They were ordered to break off mid-mission and return to base. The war was over. The Mitchell had flown its last combat mission of World War II. The statistics of Mitchell operations defied comprehension. North American aviation produced 9,116 B-25s between 1940 and 1945, making it the most produced American twin-engine aircraft. The production peak came in March 1944, when factories completed 531 aircraft in a single month. Mitchell bombers flew over 600,000 combat sorties across all theatres. They dropped 194,000 tons of bombs, more than any other Allied medium bomber. They claimed 1,328 enemy aircraft destroyed in aerial combat, though the Mitchell was designed as a bomber, not a fighter. They destroyed thousands of ships, vehicles, locomotives, bridges, and installations. But beyond numbers, the Mitchell achieved something more significant. It validated American industrial and tactical flexibility. The Germans and Japanese had entered the war with carefully designed aircraft optimized for specific roles. As the war evolved and requirements changed, they struggled to adapt. New aircraft took years to develop, and production remained limited by material shortages and bombing. The Americans entered the war with adequate aircraft and a willingness to modify anything to meet changing needs. Need a carrier bomber? Launch B-25s from a carrier? Need a ship killer? Pack the nose with guns and add a cannon. Need close air support? Remove the bombardier and install forward-firing guns. Need long-range patrol? Add fuel tanks. Every new requirement was met by modifying existing aircraft rather than designing new ones. This flexibility extended to training and operations. German and Japanese pilots trained on specific aircraft for specific missions. Their expertise was narrow and deep. American pilots trained on standardized aircraft and learned flexible tactics. Their expertise was broad and adaptable. When requirements changed, American pilots adjusted. German and Japanese pilots struggled. Lieutenant Hans Berger, a Luftwaffe pilot who survived the war and emigrated to the United States, reflected on this difference in a 1967 interview. "We were taught that there was one correct way to fly a mission, one correct tactic for each situation. Our training was rigid and thorough. When we encountered situations our training hadn't covered, we improvised poorly. American pilots seemed to improvise naturally. They tried new tactics, adapted to circumstances, learned from mistakes. Their aircraft supported this flexibility. The B-25 could do anything. Our bombers could do one thing well. When that one thing was no longer needed, the aircraft became obsolete. The Mitchell never became obsolete because it evolved constantly. That is why America won. not because their aircraft were better, but because they were adaptable, and Americans themselves were adaptable. We Germans pursued perfection. Americans pursued good enough, in overwhelming quantity. History proved them right. After the war, surplus B-25s found new roles. Many were converted to executive transports, offering comfortable accommodations for business travel. Others became firebombers, dropping retardant on forest fires. Some were modified for mapping and survey work. A few were preserved for museums and airshows where they continue to fly today. The warbird community, collectors and pilots who restore and operate World War II aircraft, particularly favour the Mitchell. Its handling characteristics remain benign and forgiving. The Wright Cyclone engines, though maintenance-intensive, are reliable when properly cared for. The aircraft can operate from short runways unsuitable for larger warbirds. Most importantly, it looks and sounds like a combat aircraft, with the distinctive rumble of radial engines and the purposeful lines of a weapon designed for war. At airshows across America, the sight of a polished B-25 thundering past at low altitude, engines roaring, brings crowds to their feet. Many spectators don't know the technical details or combat history, but they recognize something essential about the aircraft. It looks serious, it looks capable, it looks like it means business. That perception, that sense of purposeful capability, captures the Mitchell's essence better than any specification sheet. While German and Japanese aircraft of the era often featured elegant lines and refined aesthetics, the B-25 looked workmanlike and utilitarian. Its gull wings were functional, not beautiful. Its greenhouse nose was practical, not graceful. The overall impression was of a tool designed by engineers who understood their purpose and executed it without pretense or ornament. This aesthetic honesty reflected American design philosophy in 1940. Form follows function. Beauty emerges from fitness for purpose. Ornament is waste. These principles, inherited from the Bauhaus movement and refined by Depression-era scarcity, produced aircraft that looked exactly like what they were. Fighting machines, built to accomplish a mission, return home, and do it again tomorrow. The Mitchell's greatest achievement wasn't destroying targets or winning battles. It was demonstrating that competent engineering, mass production, and tactical flexibility could defeat theoretical superiority. The Germans had better fighters, more advanced technology, and more experienced pilots. The Japanese had greater range, better maneuverability, and fanatical determination. The Americans had adequate performance, overwhelming numbers, and the willingness to adapt. In the calculus of total war, adaptation trumped perfection. The force that could adjust to changing circumstances faster than the enemy could counter them would win. The Mitchell, dismissed by German intelligence as a compromised design lacking distinction in any category, became the perfect embodiment of this principle. It wasn't the best bomber, or the best attack aircraft, or the best gunship. It was good enough at everything, produced in quantity, and adapted continuously. This is why German and Japanese pilots stopped laughing. Not because the Mitchell suddenly became a wonder weapon, but because they realized the aircraft represented something they couldn't counter. American industrial capacity, operational flexibility, and tactical innovation working together created a system more powerful than any individual weapon. The Doolittle Raid should have been impossible. Launching medium bombers from a carrier violated every principle of naval aviation. But Americans did it anyway, and succeeded. Skip bombing should have been suicidal. Flying at masthead height into anti-aircraft fire contradicted every doctrine of bomber employment. But Americans developed it anyway, and it worked. Mounting an artillery piece in a bomber's nose should have been insane. The recoil alone should have torn the aircraft apart, but Americans tried it anyway, and it became devastatingly effective. This pattern repeated throughout the war. Conventional wisdom said it couldn't be done. Americans ignored conventional wisdom and did it anyway. Sometimes they failed. Training accidents killed hundreds of pilots learning to fly the Mitchell in its early days. Field modifications sometimes created more problems than they solved. Tactical experiments occasionally ended in disaster. But Americans learned from failure, adjusted, and tried again. The enemy, bound by rigid doctrine and limited resources, couldn't match this iterative process of improvement. By 1945, the Mitchell had evolved so far from its original design that early B-25s and late-war variants barely resembled each other. The B-25A that entered service in 1941 carried 3 machine guns and 3,000 pounds of bombs. The B-25J that fought in the Pacific in 1945 carried 18 machine guns, rockets, and 4,000 pounds of bombs. Same basic airframe, completely different weapon. This evolution happened without major redesign or factory retooling. Modifications were developed in theatre, tested under combat conditions, and incorporated into production when proven effective. The cycle from field innovation to factory production took months, not years. American industry could respond to combat experience faster than the enemy could develop countermeasures. German industry, strangled by Allied bombing and resource shortages, couldn't maintain production of existing designs, let alone develop and incorporate modifications. By 1944, German aircraft factories were producing the same designs they had built in 1942, with minimal improvements. Innovation required time, materials, and security that Germany no longer possessed. Japan faced even worse constraints. Their industry had never matched American capacity, and by 1944 was collapsing under blockade and bombing. Japanese aircraft designs were excellent in 1941 but obsolete by 1944, and there were no resources to develop replacements. Japanese pilots flew outdated aircraft with dwindling fuel supplies against an enemy who improved continuously. The Mitchell story demonstrates why the Axis powers could never win a long war against America. They entered the conflict with qualitative advantages, better aircraft and more experienced crews, but they lacked the industrial capacity and systematic innovation to maintain those advantages. America entered the war with adequate aircraft and inexperienced crews, but American industry could produce them faster than they could be destroyed, and American innovation could improve them faster than enemies could counter them. This wasn't about individual brilliance or tactical genius, it was about systems and processes. The American military-industrial complex, despite its inefficiencies and occasional failures, could mobilize resources and solve problems on a scale the Axis powers couldn't match. The B-25 Mitchell, an aircraft dismissed by German intelligence analysts as unremarkable, became the perfect symbol of this systematic superiority. When German pilots laughed at the B-25 in 1942, they were judging it by traditional metrics: speed, altitude, bomb load, range. By those standards, the Mitchell was indeed unremarkable. What they failed to see was that American aircraft weren't designed to excel at one mission. They were designed to be adapted to whatever mission was needed. When the Mitchell launched from the Hornet and bombed Tokyo, it wasn't performing the mission it was designed for. It was performing a mission someone imagined it might accomplish if modified appropriately. When Mitchells armed with 18 machine guns sank Japanese convoys, they weren't executing doctrine. They were improvising based on field experience and available resources. This improvisation, this willingness to try unconventional solutions to difficult problems, defined American combat operations throughout the war. The Germans had a plan for everything and struggled when reality deviated from the plan. The Americans had guidelines and principles, but expected reality to deviate and planned accordingly. The Mitchell thrived in this environment because its design supported modification. The structure was strong enough to handle additional weight. The engines had power reserves for increased loads. The cockpit was spacious enough for extra crew or equipment. The systems were simple enough to maintain under field conditions. None of these characteristics appeared on specification sheets or impressed intelligence analysts, but they made the Mitchell more valuable in practice than more impressive aircraft were in theory. In 1985, at a reunion of Doolittle Raiders, the surviving crew members gathered to celebrate the 43rd anniversary of the Tokyo Raid. 16 men remained from the original 80. They were in their 60s and 70s, grey-haired and slower, but their memories of April 18, 1942 remained vivid. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Cole, Doolittle's co-pilot on the lead aircraft, spoke about the Mitchell to a group of aviation enthusiasts. "We didn't think we were flying anything special. It was just a bomber, newer than some, not as fancy as others. We trained on it because that's what they gave us. We launched from the Hornet because Doolittle said it was possible and we believed him. After Tokyo, when we learned what that mission had accomplished, we started seeing the Mitchell differently. It wasn't just a bomber, it was the aircraft that proved America could strike back. Every time I see one fly now, I remember that feeling on the Hornet's deck, watching the propellers spin up, feeling the engines roar, Knowing we were about to do something impossible, the Mitchell made impossible things routine. That was its real contribution. The bombers that returned from Tokyo, or rather their descendants, continued making impossible things routine for another 3 years. They sank ships that were supposed to be unsinkable. They destroyed positions that were supposed to be impregnable. They adapted to missions their designers never imagined and succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. This is why the laughter stopped. Not because the B-25 became a superweapon, but because it became omnipresent and unstoppable. German and Japanese pilots learned that wherever they operated, at whatever altitude, against whatever target, Mitchells would appear. They might be bombing from medium altitude or strafing at wave-top height. They might be carrying bombs or bristling with guns. They might be alone or in formation. But they would be there, and they would be effective. The psychological impact of this omnipresence exceeded the physical damage inflicted. Axis pilots and ground troops couldn't predict when or where Mitchells would strike. They couldn't prepare for a specific type of attack because the Mitchell conducted every type of attack. They couldn't develop effective countermeasures because the aircraft kept evolving, incorporating new weapons and tactics faster than defenses could be developed. This unpredictability, this constant adaptation, broke morale as effectively as bombs broke targets. Soldiers and pilots who can predict enemy behavior can maintain courage even in difficult circumstances. They know what to expect and can prepare mentally. When the enemy is unpredictable, when any moment might bring an attack from any direction in any form, courage erodes into anxiety and eventually into paralysis. By late 1944, German and Japanese reports increasingly mentioned this psychological dimension. Troops refused to move in daylight not because of confirmed enemy air presence, but because of the possibility of air attack. Pilots aborted missions not because they encountered enemy aircraft, but because they feared encountering them. The Mitchell had achieved what all weapon systems aspire to but few accomplish. It had defeated the enemy's will to fight before engaging them in combat. The final measure of the Mitchell's success came not from American sources but from the enemy. After the war, when historians interviewed German and Japanese veterans, they asked about Allied weapons and tactics. What did you fear most? What weapon had the greatest impact on operations? What aircraft did you least want to encounter? The answers varied by theatre and role. Infantry feared artillery, tank crews feared fighter bombers, fighter pilots feared long-range escorts. But across theatres and roles, one aircraft appeared repeatedly in responses, the B-25 Mitchell. Not because it was the most advanced or the most deadly in any single category, but because it was everywhere, doing everything and succeeding consistently. A German soldier who fought in Italy summarized the sentiment in a 1958 interview. The Americans had many aircraft, heavy bombers that destroyed cities, fighters that shot down our planes, attack aircraft that strafed our positions. Each was dangerous in its own way, but the twin-engine bomber with the bent wings, that one we feared most. It could appear at any time, flying high or low, carrying bombs or firing guns. You never knew what it would do until it was too late. Other aircraft were more powerful. That one was more relentless. You couldn't hide from it, couldn't predict it, couldn't stop it. It just kept coming, day after day, mission after mission, until nothing was left. That is why we feared it. Not because of what it could do in one attack, but because of what it did through constant presence. It wore us down. It broke our will. It made us realize we couldn't win. This testimony, from an enemy soldier who experienced the full range of Allied air power, identifies the Mitchell's true achievement. It wasn't a wonder weapon or a technological marvel. It was a reliable, adaptable, producible weapon system that could be deployed anywhere, modified for any mission, and operated by adequately trained crews with consistent success. The Germans laughed in 1942 because they judged the Mitchell by the wrong criteria. They saw an aircraft that didn't excel at anything, and concluded it was mediocre. They should have seen an aircraft that could do everything adequately, and realized it was revolutionary. In total war, versatility matters more than specialization. The force that can adapt to any situation has an advantage over forces optimized for specific situations. The Mitchell demonstrated this principle across 4 years of global combat. From launching off a carrier deck to strike Tokyo, to sinking Japanese convoys in the Bismarck Sea, to destroying bridges in Italy, to supporting ground troops in the Philippines, the Mitchell proved that adequate performance across a wide range of missions exceeds excellent performance in a narrow specialty. This lesson, learned at great cost during World War II, influenced American military aviation for decades afterward. The emphasis on multi-role capability, on aircraft that can perform multiple missions with acceptable effectiveness, rather than single missions with perfect effectiveness, derives directly from the Mitchell experience. Modern strike fighters, capable of air-to-air combat, ground attack, reconnaissance, and naval strike, are the Mitchell's descendants in philosophy if not technology. The restored B-25s still flying at airshows represent more than nostalgia or historical preservation. They embody a design philosophy that won a global war. When a Mitchell thunders overhead, engines roaring, the sound echoes not just across the airfield but across 8 decades of American aviation. That sound, that distinctive rumble of Wright Cyclones at full power, is the sound that crossed the Pacific to bomb Tokyo, sank Japanese fleets in the Bismarck Sea, shattered German convoys in the Adriatic, and supported Allied troops from New Guinea to Italy. It is the sound that made German and Japanese pilots stop laughing and start fearing. The sound of American industrial might, tactical flexibility, and operational persistence made audible. The sound of 8,916 aircraft built, 600,000 missions flown, and total war waged with systematic efficiency. The sound of the impossible becoming routine, of the adequate becoming overwhelming, of the laughable becoming unstoppable. The sound of the Mitchell, the sound of victory.